So let's just spend a couple of minutes watching our breath as usual, setting our motivation, just getting ourselves here off the highway, out of the rain, calm and focus, and just bring your attention to your body and your breath. Just watch your breath for a few minutes. So let's set our motivation for this session, for all of today, thinking these teachings are from the highest level of scope of the Lam Rim. Basically, the aspiration to attain complete and full enlightenment, not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of others. And we just, at this point, may just have admiration for this idea and a wish to just check this out, to engage in these practices, to try and generate this beautiful aspiration, the ultimate altruism. So let's just take a minute to set this as our motivation for today's sessions. Okay, great. So just to review a little bit, the presentation yesterday afternoon, or last night, we were talking a little bit about the lineage of these teachings, known as Lojong, often translated as thought transformation, mind training. We said that these are practices meant to just slowly, over repeated effort, over and over and over again, to train the mind-heart. Remember I said the word, all these words that are often translated as mind also connote heart. So this could be also called developing a good heart. These practices for just training your mind, training your heart, developing this exchange of self and others. Okay, this is the tradition of these teachings, and there's two lineages of developing bodhicitta, or this mind that wishes for enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. One is the lineage of the 7-point cause and effect, which is mostly based on thinking of all sentient beings as having been our mother in some past life, and so, you know, we owe it to them to bring them to enlightenment. And then this lineage is based on what's called exchanging self for others, which basically means no matter what your previous relationship with all other beings, it doesn't matter. We're all alike in wanting happiness and wanting to avoid suffering. There's no difference between ourselves and others. having this sort of self-absorbed, self-cherishing that's based on the wrong view of self has been the cause of all of our problems, and it's time to turn it around, time to switch it around. Okay, so that's this lineage of teachings is based on this. And I also mentioned the Kadampa lamas. Most of the texts in this genre come from this period of the Kadampas, which is just right after Lama Atisha, and a couple of hundred years after Lama Atisha taught in Tibet, which is around 1000 AD or so. Now, somebody was asking after class last night, what's the relationship between this text and the 8 verses? Remember I said that it was by hearing one of the verses of the 8 verses that Geshe Cheka was inspired to travel all the way to Lhasa and seek out this lineage of teachings. So what's the difference? And it's interesting, all of these teachings inspired many, many texts. Okay, these thought transformation teachings, the Kadampa lamas around this time period between about 1000 AD and about 1200 composed many, many texts based on this thought transformation teachings, including the 8 verses, which we find on the trail up at the top of the hill. This 7-point thought transformation, another common one that you may have heard of is the Wheel of Sharp Weapons. Have you heard of, some of you may have heard of that Wheel of Sharp Weapons. That's another one of the Lojong texts. There's one that's called, I've forgotten the name, something about Peacock in the Poison Grove or something like that. And this is an analogy that's very interesting, and it comes from this legend that peacocks sought out poisonous plants and ate them, and it made their feathers more colorful. Okay, so they basically thrived on plants that for other animals were considered poisonous, and it made their feathers more and more beautiful. And this is an analogy to bodhisattvas, okay? Taking difficult conditions into the path, especially like this bravery of a bodhisattva, in part consists of taking all kinds of adverse circumstances, what would be considered poisons and obstacles and things like that, and transforming them into the path, which is a big part of these Lojong teachings. So that's why the analogy of the peacock transforming the poison into these beautiful lustrous feathers is an analogy for the bodhisattva. Okay, we don't want it all easy, that way you can't practice. There's a bumper sticker that Lama Zopa came up with that says, you know, no anger, no enemy, like no enemy, no development of patience. Like all of these adverse circumstances can actually help us develop on the path. And that's a big part of what these teachings are about. So there's a lot of these different Lojong or thought transformation text that you'll see. So that's the relationship between the 8 verses and the 7-point thought transformation and the Wheel of Sharp Weapons and all these other texts. They are composed right around the same time, inspired by these teachings, inspired by these basic Lojong teachings. Okay, so our text, the actual root text that we're going to be using for this class, is in the appendix of this book, The Kindness of Others, that you should all have. So we'll be referring to that. The bulk of the text is a line-by-line commentary on the root text, and then the root text as it is found in the very back appendix. So that's what we're going to be referring to. It's interesting here, I've discovered when I opened up this book that this text is attributed to Pabanka Rinpoche instead of Geshe Cheka. It's very interesting. Pabanka Rinpoche made a couple of changes in the root text by Geshe Cheka based on the Gelugpa lineage of teachings, okay? But the changes were minor, and it's quite interesting. I'm not quite sure why they've decided to change the author. There were just sort of some editorial changes made by Pabanka Rinpoche. But one of the authors of this text is my next door neighbor, and so when he comes back from England, I'm going to ask him why he said by Pabanka Rinpoche here. But this is basically the root text by Geshe Cheka that I've been talking about. Okay, with a couple of changes, and we'll get into what that is. So has everybody found the appendix at the very end, the root text? Okay. So we're going to just be going through, not necessarily line by line, but at least section by section. Like I explained yesterday, we're going to be going through the 7 points in the lectures between now and Sunday morning. Okay. So first, it starts out with an homage to great compassion. And the reason for this is that great compassion is said to give rise to all the bodhisattvas that gives rise to all the Buddhas. Okay, so this great compassion, which is this wish for all beings to be free from suffering, and beyond that, the wish to actually accomplish it oneself, gives rise to all Buddhas. Because without having this aspiration, there's no way that you can become a Buddha. There's just no way you can become a fully enlightened being. So that's why these teachings are just so fundamental. There's just no way at all. And the path is said to comprise of method and wisdom. Okay? Method is the development of this bodhicitta, this development of this aspiration to become enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings. And wisdom is the insight into the nature of reality, especially the emptiness. Okay? And without both of these two, you can't become a Buddha. There's just no way at all. Okay? If you have wisdom alone, if you just develop the wisdom side, you can become liberated from cyclic existence. You can become what's called a Hinayana Arhat and liberated from cyclic existence. But without the development of bodhicitta, without the method side being developed, there's just no way at all that you can become a fully enlightened being and thereby develop all the capacity to benefit all beings. Like Buddhas have all of these special qualities that these Hinayana Arhats, beings that are just liberated from samsara, don't have. Particularly omniscient mind. And this is really important. Buddhas have the capacity to see the karma of all beings, to directly see what their karma is, to directly see what the best way to help them is. Okay, so this is why the development of this compassion, which leads to this bodhisattva attitude of wishing for enlightenment for the benefit of all beings, is so important. And that's also what's referred to in the second line. The essence of this nectar of secret instructions is transmitted from the master from Sumatra. So this is the nectar, it's sort of distilled. The nectar of all the teachings of the Buddha is in this text. And I'm fond of saying that, you know, if I were stranded on a desert island, this is the one text that I would like to have with me, because it really contains all of the Buddha's teachings. Those of you who have studied Lamrim, you'll see as we're going through, it really contains all of the Lamrim. Everything that you need to get enlightened is in this text. No exaggeration. Okay, it's really an amazing text. I sort of discovered in my relationship with these texts, mostly when I was in this long retreat, and there are a couple of stories that come out of that retreat that I'll share with you, but I just, you know, this text came up for me so strongly when I was in long retreat, and I really saw how practicing the teachings as they're explained in this text is really, really the key to developing this bodhicitta, this mind of wanting enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. And then when Somo last fall was asking, she was saying, oh, we always like to do a weekend on bodhicitta, you know, would you like to do that? And immediately, without even hesitating, I thought, oh, this is the text that I want to teach, because it's just so important, so vital. So it contains, as it says, the nectar of the secret instruction, transmitted from the master from Sumatra. And that's our old friend Sir Lingpa, remember? The one that Atisha made this perilous sea voyage to study with. So that's who's being referred to now, the master of Sumatra. And this was Atisha's guru that he respected over all other gurus out of his, I think it was 127, because he gave him this instruction. And Atisha thought it was so precious that any time he even heard Sir Lingpa's name mentioned, he would stand up out of reverence. Okay, so this is the master from Sumatra. You should understand the significance of this instruction is like a diamond, the sun, and a medicinal tree. This time of the 5 degenerations will then be transformed into the path to the fully awakened state. Okay, so these analogies, this diamond, the sun, the medicinal tree, just show how precious and unique these teachings are. The time of the 5 degenerations, this refers to our age. Okay, our age is referred to as the time of the 5 degenerations. In Hindu thought, they call it the Kali Yuga. You may have heard this term, Kali Yuga, this degenerate age. In a lot of the texts that we study, they refer to this time as the degenerate age. And the 5 degenerations we won't go through in detail, but it's basically lifespan is getting shorter, mental afflictions of beings are increasing, you know, the view is getting worse and worse and worse. And I can even think in my lifetime, I can really see how things have really degenerated, like things that would have just seemed completely inconceivable in the 50s and 60s. I was a hippie teenager, and we're all into like peace and love and like all this sort of utopian everything. And what are teenagers these days into? You know, just slashing and all of this, you know. So I don't mean to be like our parents were when we were hippie teenagers going, oh, kids these days, but really like kids these days, you know. It's really, I think for a lot of us, we can see even in our lifetime, like television and the level of violence and the media, and you know, it's just kind of crazy. So even in the last like 50 years, to just see how things have degenerated, and according to the scriptures, this is a degenerate age. You know, this really is, and a lot of these things are degenerating. But for us brave awakening warriors, we can take all of these conditions and use them in the path. And this is why these teachings are so important. You don't just say, oh, forget it, I'm going to throw in the towel, it's too hard, you know, all these violent TV shows, I'm completely overwhelmed, I'm just going to pray to be reborn in a pure land, and then maybe everything will be fine and I'll be able to practice. Like, this is just saying, hey, forget about that. Like, this is such a great opportunity to practice, because everything's against us. So we have to just be fierce and strong and really use all of these conditions that come up to practice. So that's what these lines are referring to. Like, the worse it gets, you know, the more poison there is in the forest, the more beautiful the peacock's feathers become. And this is how we have to practice. Okay? So that's this lineage of teachings. Now, the actual instructions are given in 7 points. And the first is explain the preliminaries as a basis for the practice. One little line that contains the first 2 entire scopes of the Lam Rim, okay? And this is why you have to get teachings on this text, because otherwise you'd be like, preliminary what? Like what? You know, these prayers that I say before I do my meditation, or these practices Lama Zopa gives us is 100,000 of this, that, and the other thing. Like, what's meant here? And what this is referring to, as I said yesterday, this teaching comes from the 3rd scope of the Lam Rim. And a lot of you are familiar, but there are some new people that don't know about the Lam Rim, so I'll just review this quickly. Okay, there are said to be 3 scopes of training according to the stages of the path to enlightenment. And the first scope is appropriate for people who don't really care about liberation from the cycle of samsara, the cycle of rebirth. They just want a better rebirth, right? They just want to not suffer quite so much next time around. You know, things are kind of bad in this lifetime, but next time they just like a better deal. Okay? So what they meditate on, you know, they think about sort of the drawbacks of the suffering in the lower realms. Buddhism explains our realm in terms of 6 different realms of, you know, either greater or lesser suffering. And we're kind of right in the middle as humans. You know, we have an even balance of suffering and pleasure in our realm. And there are realms that are called the hell realms in Buddhism that are seen as realms of great, intense suffering. Okay, created by our karma, created by our mental afflictions. We create the cause for a reality that's filled with this incredible suffering. There's also a realm that's filled with mostly unsatisfied longing and desire. And that's called the Preta realm, or the hungry ghost realm. That's just filled, these beings just are never ever satisfied, you know. And we can find analogies to all of this in the human realm, can't we? Like minds that are just so filled with anger, thoughts of anger and violence, that they just create a hellish existence, or a mind that's filled completely with, you know, longing and unsatisfied desire and always wanting more and more and more. But in Buddhism, these are spoken of as different realms. But again, they're just created by the mind, just created by imprints in the mind. And then the animal realm is another one, and this is the one that most of us can see really obviously. Okay, and the suffering of the animal realm is explained mostly in terms of ignorance and stupidity. Like they just, you know, as we've said several times, you can say mantras to your dog or cat and try and teach them how to meditate, and they're just never going to get it because they don't have the karma, you know. Their realm is characterized by this ignorance and stupidity. And then there are 2 realms that are often called God realms, but this isn't like the God in Christianity like Jehovah. These are sort of these, they're called devas in Sanskrit, and they're these beings that enjoy incredible sense pleasure, you know. It's a result of good karma of a certain kind that they just, their life is filled with incredible sense pleasures, okay? But it's said in the teachings that to be a human is best. Why? Because we have this balance between pleasure and suffering. Like we have enough suffering to get us motivated that maybe we want to do something about it. It's not so terrific, but yet we're not sort of like burning in hell and, you know, completely overwhelmed by suffering so that we can't practice the spiritual path at all. And I often give the analogy of even in this life, you know, when you're experiencing like intense physical pain of some kind, there's just no way to meditate. You know, you sit down. I have a friend who has really bad migraines and they last for 3 days and she's just completely overwhelmed by this physical pain and suffering, and there's really no way for her to meditate. She's just completely kind of filled with this pain and aversion to it, and that's her whole mind state, you know. Or if you're experiencing like extreme sense pleasure, then what would be the motivation? Hey, it's pretty good, you know, I'm just sort of lying back, experiencing all this sense pleasure. There's just no motivation to practice. So the human realm is seen to be best, especially in terms of spiritual practice, because there's this balance of pleasure and pain. Like you're good enough off, you're not experiencing such intense pleasure so that you can practice, but, you know, it's not so good that you're complacent about it either, okay? So and then the second scope, the second level of motivation in the stages of the path is wanting to be free of cyclic existence altogether. Like you see the faults of all of it. You're like, even to be in a God realm is no good because still I'm subject to rebirth. You know, your good karma wears out, your karma for the God realm rebirth wears out, and next rebirth is not going to be good at all because then, you know, you've kind of burned up all your stores of good karma. So you see that no matter what realm of existence, even the higher realms are subject to suffering, subject to change. There's no guarantee. You know, so you just say, forget about it. I just want to get out completely. And then this is the level of motivation where your aspiration is liberation from samsara, just liberation from the cycle of rebirth. And then the highest level of motivation is the one that we're talking about in these teachings. It's not good enough just to be free of suffering myself and go off, you know. You need to help everybody else out. Everybody's the same as you in wanting to avoid suffering and wanting happiness. And so it would be totally selfish just to get liberation for yourself and just go off complacently. Oh, I'm in nirvana now. Okay, great. Everything's fine and dandy, and everybody else is experiencing incredible suffering. Okay? So you want to develop all of those qualities that I talked about, like the qualities especially of omniscient mind, the qualities of a fully enlightened being, in order to help all other beings. Okay? So that's the highest level of motivation. The motivation to develop this bodhicitta aspiration. Okay, so the preliminaries are the practices that are common to the first two scopes, and there are 4 of them that I'll talk about just briefly, and those of you that are in the Sunday morning Lam Rim class, these are the ones that we're going through right now. So these will be familiar, but for the new people and the people that don't have Lam Rim background, I'll just go through them briefly. The first one is the precious human rebirth, and this is the one we've been talking about the last couple of Sunday mornings in Sunday morning class, okay? And this is basically just getting how incredibly fortunate those of us sitting in this room right now are. Like how rare it is to have gotten all the karmic causes together to have the life that you have now. And the point of meditating on this is so you just don't waste your time, you know? Last weekend I talked about this friend of mine who got, 16 episodes of some old TV sitcom from Netflix, and so she was spending her nights for about 5 hours a night, going through these old episodes, and I was like, don't do this with your precious life, So this is it. You really get what an incredible opportunity this is to practice. When you think about all the places that you could be born in cyclic existence, to be a human being with the qualities that you have now of intelligence, of interest in spiritual practice, the teachings that are available for us now, it's crazy. Once again, 50 years ago, we're all into peace and love and whatever, but the teachings that are available now weren't even available then. I remember when I was a teenager, getting interested in Buddhism, and I was reading these completely impenetrable, like, commentaries, you know, in translations by these really early translators that you just couldn't make head nor tail out of them. And there were like 5 books about Buddhism in the library, and they're all these impenetrable, you know, and they used words like sin, and they had all these sort of Christian, you know, things sort of laid on top, and they were really hard, and I still really struggled to find it. And now look, we've got gateways right down the street, like an entire huge store filled with books that didn't even exist, you know, 20 or 30 years ago. So it's unbelievable that we have these teachings. We have people like Khensa Rinpoche coming here and talking about emptiness every Sunday morning, like the, you know, highest level of teachings on the path are just available to us. And all we have to do is just get in our car and drive. Like in Tibet, like I said last night with Geshe Chekwa, you know, he like walked from Kham to Lhasa, and it took him months and months and months on the basis of one little verse that he'd overheard in the hallway, you know. And here we have everything available to us, like open up the Snow Lion catalog and like the ads for the lamas giving these incredible, precious secret teachings. So I think, you know, this is the first meditation that we always do on the stages of the path, just to wake us up out of our complacency. Like we get it, how incredibly rare and precious this chance is, and then we're motivated not to waste it. Okay? And that's the whole point of the meditation on the precious human rebirth. And the second big topic is impermanence and death. And this gives the same feeling of, I don't want to waste my time. Because in this meditation, you really focus on the transitoriness of it all. You know, how things are constantly changing. Now we have this precious opportunity. It could be lost in a second. Because everything is a result of causes and conditions. What we have now is a result of an unbelievably rare, you know, coming together of all of these causes and conditions, and our karma could shift in a second. And I often mention karma ripens at the rate of 65 karmic instants per finger snap. You know, our hour and a half here this morning is so expensive karmically. Like, don't freak out, don't leave just because it's expensive. It's great, but keep the ball, you know, keep the snowball effect going. And this is what it's about, okay? Just keeping the ball rolling. It's really expensive karma to get these teachings, so you have an obligation to put them into practice and to keep the snowball rolling. And this is what this meditation is all about. Just think, you could get transferred to Omaha, Nebraska next week, you know, and then Land of Medicine Buddha would no longer be in your reality. You know, I don't know that there's no Dharma teachings. I sort of have this thing about the Midwest that may be unfounded, that like it's sort of just this devoid land of cornfields where there's like no, you know, spiritual, and it may be completely wrong, but it's just, you know what I'm saying. It's like here in Santa Cruz especially, we're just so fortunate, you know, there's just to open up the good times calendar any given week and you have your choice, you know, and there are a lot of places that aren't like this at all. There are places where you have no freedom to practice a religion. I have this friend who went to Russia to teach right after the fall of the Soviet Union, and he went to teach Buddhism, which was like totally against the law, just 2 years previously. And he said during the breaks he couldn't even go to the bathroom because people were just rushing at him like they were so hungry because they hadn't been able to get any teachings or any practice at all, you know. So this is it. And it could shift at any minute, you know. It really could. Like, we think that it's so guaranteed our life, and it's just not. I mean, not even getting transferred to Omaha, but, you know, everything could shift in a minute. So we have to really think of the preciousness of this chance that we have. Okay. And then the next topic of these preliminaries to focus on is refuge in karma. Refuge in karma. And this is really important. Those of you who were at Loudon Nelson last Wednesday night, I went off on this tirade about karma for an hour and a half and completely overwhelmed everyone with all these facts. There were a lot of glassy-eyed people at the end, but it was like, you have to understand these things as soon as possible. Like, I couldn't let them go another week without understanding karma, you know. And the reason for this, it's just so important to understand how cause and effect works, you know. Things aren't random. You can't do whatever you want to get happiness, you know. Your happiness results from your virtue in the past, period. That's all. Any happy moment that you have, any moment of pleasure, the only cause for it is some virtue that you did in the past. You can't get happiness by bulldozing over other people to get what you want. That will only cause you suffering. And these Lojong teachings don't make sense at all unless you understand that. Like if you really understand where your happiness comes from, do these teachings make the slightest bit of sense. Otherwise, like I said last night, you think I'm just, being a big meanie trying to get you to give up your happiness for other beings, and I'm just trying to make you suffer and like give up all the goodies. And that's not it at all. But for this, you really have to understand karma and understand where your happiness comes from. Does it come from just trying to grab everything for yourself and not thinking about other people's feelings at all? Absolutely not. That's the cause of all of your suffering. Okay? And so it's really important. That's why karma is a really big preliminary to just getting it, to just getting what this Lojong is all about. Because otherwise it's just not going to make any sense. If you think the world is just some random place. When I was growing up, like my father said, his favorite expression was, look out for number one. That was my big teaching. That was like the big wrong view of my childhood was, look out for number one because no one else is going to do it for you, and like just this whole terrible wrong view of like grasp and like just claw your way through life because man, baby, nobody else is going to do anything. It was awful, it's just taken me so long to like switch, these wrong views that we're raised with. And this, karma says no way. Karma says absolutely no way. Your only happiness comes from virtue and from taking care of other beings. And we can even feel this. Just, how you kind of feel so uptight when you just want everything to go your way. Like when you're in a situation where you're just trying to control it and you're freaking out because it's like not going your way and you're trying to manipulate. How much happiness even in the moment, like forget about karma, even in the moment, that tight mind that just kind of wants everything and it needs to be like this or else I'm not going to be happy and I need to get it like right there. Forget it. Like even in the moment, that doesn't give us any happiness at all. Even instantaneously, it's a cause of suffering. So just forget about it. Just let it go. The mind that just says, it's okay. Whatever you want is fine. Just this easy, relaxed mind that just isn't clutching and manipulating and trying to create this happiness for ourselves in all the wrong ways, by scratching and clawing and looking out for number one, which according to Buddhism is just a cause for unbelievable suffering in the future, okay? So this is the importance of understanding karma and refuge. What's refuge? What's refuge anyway? Is it coming in here and doing prostrations and bowing down to these golden statues? No way. Like the real refuge is Dharma. What's Dharma? These teachings that help you transform your relationship to reality to reduce your suffering. Like that's it. And that's all Lord Buddha was interested in teaching. I often tell this story. He had these students that were really interested, especially this one who asked him all these questions about like cosmology and what's the beginning of the universe and does the universe have an end and after you die where do you go and like how did it all begin and all of this stuff. And it's like none of that is going to address your suffering. And the story he told this student was, when you get shot by a poison arrow, before you let the doctor pull the arrow out, do you have to know like what village the guy who shot you was from and what was his caste and what was his father's name and what was his mother, and all of this stuff? Forget it. The only thing that's important is to know the cause of your suffering and how to end it. And forget about all of this other stuff. So that's what the Dharma is. That's what the teachings of the Buddha are. It's all about how to end your suffering. Okay? So that's the real refuge. That's the real refuge. Understanding these teachings, understanding karma, understanding the nature of reality. Okay? Transforming your mind, creating the causes for your future happiness and your future enlightenment. And that's what we're really taking refuge in. Okay? And then the Buddha was the person who taught it. So we take refuge in the Buddha as the teacher who gave us these precious teachings. the Sangha as our community of fellow practitioners who really help us on the path, okay? So this is the real refuge, is just, saying, okay, I've tried to get happiness all of these other ways. I tried my whole life this looking out for number one business, and all I am is just uptight and controlling, and like I can't find happiness anywhere. So I'm going to just try it in a different way now, okay? And then the last of the preliminaries that we're just going to talk about briefly is meditating on the faults and sufferings of cyclic existence, okay? And this is all about no matter where you're born, even if it's a great, life, like, who's the guy, I'm totally blanking, the Microsoft, Bill Gates, even if you're Bill Gates, and even if now you're developing altruism, giving millions and millions of dollars away and all of these foundations, and it's wonderful, he has all of this money and now he's doing all of these great things in it. Even if you're born as Bill Gates and you have all of this sense pleasure and you even have altruism, still, unless Bill Gates is an enlightened being, which he very well could be, a Buddha manifesting as this rich person to show us all what to do with our wealth, and that's quite possible. But if he's not, at some point, he's not going to be Bill Gates anymore, and he's going to be subject to rebirth, and there's going to be no control whatsoever. He's going to be just thrown into his next rebirth according to his karma, according to his mental afflictions, without any control at all. So the fault of cyclic existence is no matter where you're born, no matter how good your temporary situation is, you're not free of karma yet. You're not free of mental afflictions, and you have no control over where you're going to go next. And that's why you have to get out of this cycle altogether, because it's not within your control. Until you're an Arya Bodhisattva, you have a direct realization of emptiness. You have high level of realizations. No matter what a good person you try to be in this life, you have no control over your next rebirth at all. You have no idea. I'm fond of saying we have these deep karmic pockets. We have all of this karma from past lives. We don't have a clue what we're going to be in our next life. We just have to try as much as possible to purify and accumulate virtue, and that's a really good thing, but until we're at a very high level, we really don't have any control, and we have no idea what's going to ripen next. So we've just got to get out of here altogether. It's not enough to be one of these lower scope practitioners and to just want a better rebirth next time. You got to just check out of the whole scene. It's doomed. Just get out. Just get the hell out. And these teachings tell you how to do that. Okay? So these are the preliminaries to being able to understand what these teachings are, and I've just had to skim over them because that's not the time. We're doing 11 weeks worth on Sunday morning of the whole path, and I've just tried to cram it into 25 minutes. So, okay, but those are the preliminaries, the lower and middle scope teachings. Okay, are there any questions on this so far? Okay. So, the main practice, point number 2, okay? So after first training in the preliminaries, the actual practice, training in the awakening mind, how to train in the ultimate awakening mind, and how to train in the conventional awakening mind. And now this is the one of the little editorial things that Pabanka Rinpoche did, was reverse the order of these next 2 points. Okay, and first let me explain a little bit what conventional and ultimate awakening mind refers to. The conventional awakening mind, or conventional bodhicitta, bodhicitta is the word that means awakening mind, is what I keep referring to as this aspiration to attain full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. Okay, and there are 2 parts of the definition. Wanting to attain full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. Okay, so the motivation is for sentient beings, and what you're trying to do for their sake is attain enlightenment. And this is what's known as the conventional bodhicitta, or conventional awakening mind. Okay, and this is the main subject of this text. Now, ultimate bodhicitta, there's another phrase called ultimate bodhicitta, and what this refers to is the direct perception of emptiness in the mind stream of a bodhisattva. Okay? This is the wisdom part. Remember I said there's method and wisdom? These 2 are both necessary for becoming a Buddha. The method side is the conventional bodhicitta, conventional awakening mind. And that's the one that's dependent on compassion, overcoming self-cherishing, developing this wish to get enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings. And then the wisdom side is this ultimate bodhicitta, the direct realization of emptiness in the mind stream of a bodhisattva. Now it's interesting, I've had this question for a long time. Why do they call it bodhicitta? Why is this called ultimate bodhicitta? Since bodhicitta for us usually connotes this conventional awakening mind. Like, why do they call this realization of emptiness ultimate bodhicitta? And I've asked a lot of lamas this question. It's kind of gratifying. Actually, I have all of these questions, and usually you think it's just because I'm really stupid and I haven't studied much. And then every once in a while I'll find, some great scholar says, I've always wondered that too. And I was reading a book by Jeffrey Hopkins, who's translated these incredible, maps of the profound. Ben has this book. It's 2,000 pages of this unbelievable translation. So I found a book by Jeffrey Hopkins, and he's like, I always wondered why they called it ultimate bodhicitta, and I've never really gotten a good answer. And I was like, oh, Jeffrey, thank you so much. I always just thought I was dumb and had missed some essential point. But I actually have a theory, and I'll share this theory with you. This doesn't come from any lama, but it's basically relates to this method and wisdom business, okay? You need both to get enlightened. So bodhicitta means mind of awakening or mind of enlightenment. So you need the direct realization of emptiness to become a Buddha too. Okay, so I think that's why they call it bodhicitta, because that's part of this mind that you need to actually wake up and become a Buddha. So I think that's why they refer to it as bodhicitta. So the conventional one is this method side, like this aspiration, with conceptual thought, you come up with this aspiration to want to get enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings. But a really necessary component of that is development of wisdom, which in this case refers especially to that direct perception of the nature of reality or its lack of inherent existence. Okay, so these are the two bodhicittas. And in the original text by Geshe Chekawa, the ultimate awakening mind was presented first, and then conventional awakening mind. And Pabonka Rinpoche's take on this is that the wisdom, this wisdom that sees that things aren't inherently existent, is only for really, presenting that first is appropriate for really advanced practitioners. But for most of the rest of us, I think he's saying that we're all sort of losers in a way. I sort of took offense at this, but he's saying, okay, for the rest of y'all, we're going to develop conventional bodhicitta first. That makes more sense. And then we're going to go into the ultimate bodhicitta. So he's reversed these two. And this is one of the reasons that this text is ascribed to him. He just reversed the order. So we're going to talk about conventional awakening mind first. Okay? And that's going to be the bulk of the rest of this session today. And within this is the reason they call this second point the main practice. Within this is this instruction on the meditation technique of Tonglen, giving and taking. So we're going to do this morning, and then our meditation session later on this morning at 11:30 is going to be a Tonglen giving and taking meditation. Okay. Now, there's a couple of points. There's 5 points in this conventional bodhicitta section of the text. So the first point is known as equanimity. Okay, you always have to start, this is sort of leveling out the playing field. Before you can develop things like loving kindness, compassion, all of these wonderful altruistic intentions, first you have to level out the playing field. And this is called equanimity. And what this means is meditating on how yourself and all other beings are just equal. It's not right to make such a huge distinction. And we did a meditation last night on the kindness of others, and part of that section was just meditating about how all other beings want happiness and don't want suffering. This thing that we have of being the center of our own universe and being so self-absorbed is just wrong. Like, we're all the same. Everyone's the same in not wanting suffering and in wanting happiness. So the first step is just establishing this equanimity. How can you develop compassion if you still, are so strongly attached to your friends and think that your friends deserve all the happiness in the world. Like you and your friends deserve everything, and your enemies should just, deserve the worst suffering. It's like, no way how can you develop compassion for your enemies if you don't at least acknowledge that they're equal to you, in wanting happiness and wanting to avoid suffering. Okay, so first, this is the first step, this developing this equanimity. Of course, we're closer to some people than we are of others. The Buddha's not saying don't have friends, and don't have people that you like to hang out with. Like, that's not the point. But the point is, don't say, ooh, I want all the good stuff for me and my friends, and I could care less what happens to strangers and enemies. It's just acknowledging, hey, everybody, it's just being fair about it. Like, everybody's the same. And everybody deserves happiness and deserves to be free of suffering. So it's just leveling it out. And it doesn't mean that we have to be either best friends with everybody or just sort of neutral and non-attached and you don't care about anyone. This isn't what it's about. Obviously, we're still closer to some people than others, but it's not about wanting all the good stuff for us and our friends. Okay? So that's the first point. The second one, contemplating the many faults resulting from self-cherishing. In this line in the text it says, banish the one to blame for everything. Okay, the first line of the text under subsection A, training the mind in conventional awakening mind. Banish the one to blame for everything. Guess who the one to blame for everything is? 3 guesses and the first 2 don't count. Okay? Self-cherishing, okay? The one to blame for everything. All of our suffering comes from self-cherishing. Period. Sorry. It's true. It's great though. Now you know, right? You can do something about it. Okay. This is really interesting, and I'll share an experience I had in this long retreat which made me sort of fall in love with this text. I went off for a long retreat, initially in the desert in Arizona in this yurt, kind of exactly like the meditation yurt out, or the massage yurt out by the swimming pool, and I was living in the middle of the desert surrounded by rattlesnakes and, poisonous everything, the most horrific, creepy, crawly things in the world. Like, in the desert in Arizona, like these, they're huge, these gross things that you've never seen before in your life, and they have so many legs, and they're just awful. It was like so intense. And those yurts are not impervious at all. There'd be these centipedes like this, and there's nothing that make me like jump up on furniture and scream like a girl more than like something this long that has all of these legs. So it was quite an experience. And about a year into the retreat, I was meditating. I remember this day really clearly. It was actually the birthday of the great Bodhisattva Martin Luther King Jr. in the year 2001, and I was doing meditation, and suddenly my mother sprang to mind, who had passed away about 20 years previously to this experience. And I was just, I was doing a lot of meditation on bodhicitta, and I just thought of my mother, and I just thought about what a selfish, horrific teenager I'd been, especially as a teenager. It was just awful. I was sort of this hippie teenager. By the time I was Laura's age, I was already like hitchhiking all over the country by myself, living in these communes and these ashrams. And I was just thinking, oh my God, they must have been freaking out, like my poor parents, But I was just so, self-absorbed and selfish, and I didn't think at all about how they felt. I just needed to do my thing, and I needed my freedom. And so I was just thinking about my poor parents, especially my mother, and how she passed away when I was in my early 20s, and I just never really had time for that relationship to change to what it is when you're an adult and you can like become friends with your mother, especially as a woman. Like, a lot of people become really good buddies with their mom, but it's after a certain point, right? After all that rebellious teenage stuff. And so I was thinking about it, and then it was so intense for about 3 days following, like this was just, what set me off. And for about 3 days, they say when you're dying, like you're falling off a cliff and your whole life flashes before your eyes before you hit the bottom. And this is sort of my whole life flashing before my eyes in this 3 days, mostly about how unbelievably selfish I had been and how much suffering it had caused me and everyone else. And it was awful. Like, until that point, I think I always thought I was really a nice person. Like, I was nice and everybody liked me and I'm so nice, And then I just go into solitary confinement within my own mind, and the truth, the ugly, horrid truth comes out, And so for 3 days, I I was thinking about how everything in my life, everything from my lifelong, really difficult relationship with my father through just, the slightest bit of suffering came from selfishness. Just totally came from self-absorption and selfishness, and there wasn't one exception. I mean, by day 2, I was desperately trying to find an exception because it was just so intense. I was like, no, it can't all be because I'm just so yes, it is, So I went through this thing, and I just was filled with this huge remorse, and I just saw that everything, every suffering, and that was just the stuff that I'd experienced, much less like future suffering I created by all this crappy karma of selfishness and just running over everyone else's feelings and just doing what I wanted and all of this stuff. I mean, we won't even delve into like intimate relationships and how much negative karma I've created. It's one of the reasons I'm a nun now. It's like, just get rid of that whole realm of creating negative karma. It was all of it. It was just all of it. It was so intense. So at that point, out of desperation and horror over my reality, I really thought of this text, and I just made this firm commitment to just study and learn this text and try and practice as much as I possibly could just to turn this thing around, because it was just so horrific. And it was great. It was so painful, but it was great because I really got over, we were talking in Loud Nelson about the truth of suffering for like 2 sessions, and everyone is like, oh, it's so awful suffering. And one guy came in last week and he said, it's just a big relief to just admit it finally. He's like, just to really admit that I'm suffering. And I sort of felt that way too after this experience. What a relief to admit that Geshe Chekwa is right, that Lord Buddha's right. Like finally I got over my denial of thinking that there was, some suffering not caused by self-cherishing. It's like, oh, whew. Lord Buddha's right. Great. Now I can start, And I really felt like that was my real beginning of the path. We have to get over our denial in a lot of ways and see where we really are to be able to begin. So that was my big epiphany on Martin Luther King Day, 2001. I thought I'd just share it all with you because it was so huge. So, and I also really saw how this self-cherishing, selfish, grasping mind is so related to this view that we have of self, the root ignorance that drives samsara. And you've heard this probably in other Lamrim teachings, those of you who have studied, the root of samsara is ignorance. Mostly ignorance about the way in which we exist. And this is the cause of all of our self-cherishing too. So the two are really inextricably entwined, And yesterday I said, in order to be able to practice these teachings, you really need to understand emptiness, especially the way that the self doesn't exist in the way we think it does. Do we exist? Sure. You're sitting on this cushion right now, you had breakfast before you came here. We're going to sit here all day. You exist. And that there's not a problem with that. But we don't exist in the way that we think we do. We think that there's some solid entity that exists from its own side, sort of like, there's this thing inside you that's really you. We talked in the Sunday morning class a while ago about like thinking that there's this little something that lives inside your head, kind of right behind your eyes mostly, and you think it's sort of looking out through your eyes. The eyes are these windows that the real you is somewhere in here, kind of looking out and like, working the levers and like working your arm and your leg and like your head and making your mouth go like this, and we really think that. We think that there's something in us that's really us that's sort of working the whole system, And that's one of the ways that this wrong view about self manifests itself. And according to Buddhism, it's just plain wrong. Like there is no thing inside of you that's really you, All that we are this conglomeration of, form, body, constantly changing, aging, wrinkling, graying, body, and all of this, different functions of mind. So there's, according to Buddhism, there's like 4 what are called mental aggregates in one body, form aggregate, and it's all sort of stuck together for the moment, really temporarily, and we think it's some solid thing. And then we have this conception that we glom on top of that, and we call that me. And that's all it is. It's like the 5 aggregates, 4 of mind, 1 of body, temporarily stuck together, and we think it's some big deal, you know? And we do everything we can to protect it from harm and get all the good stuff, and it's this solid thing that we are, you know, trying to manipulate. And it's just a fantasy, you know? It's just this thought that we have that we've glommed on top of all of these little bits and pieces. And I think Tenzin Chogkyi is some really solid thing. And all it is just this barest, subtlest little blip of mind stream that goes from life to life, somehow got associated with this body that was born in 1957 from very tall parents. So now it's really tall, you know, and it's got green eyes and it looks like this. And then there's some imprints from my past life, which is why I was reading all these weird books when I was in high school, and like that was good. And then there's this thing, but I think it's really me, you know, and it's just, no way is it me. Anywhere from 5 minutes to like 40 years from now, it's not going to be existing anymore. That little blip of a mind stream, hopefully, if I'm lucky, they'll have a couple of more good imprints on it, you know, will be associated with another conglomeration of body and mind later on, and that's all there is to it, you know. And I think it's so solid, and it's like, I want my way, you know. So much of my suffering, I think, is like, I'm so sensitive, you know, my feelings are so easily hurt. Well, who's being hurt, you know? Somebody has some judgment, like because of their karma, they see something that they're glomming onto my body and mind, and then they say something about what their projection is, and then like my feelings are hurt. Like, what's up with that? You know, it has nothing to do with who I am, which is nothing anyway but a conglomeration, you know? And all of our suffering comes from this. It's so crazy. It's just crazy. So part of this path is just deconstruct it. Forget it. It's the source of all of our suffering. Just get rid of it. You know, just deconstruct the whole thing. Okay? So this is the cause of all of our suffering. Just seeing how this self-cherishing that comes on top of this total hallucination. You know, total hallucination. There's a word in Tibetan called gakcha. And it means the object of refutation. That's the fancy Jeffrey Hopkins, you know, translation of gakcha. And it's the hallucination that drives all of our suffering and drives our rebirth. It's like thinking that there's this little sort of Casper the Ghost thing inside looking out of our eyes, you know, this thing that never existed, that never could exist, that never will exist, that we believe in so strongly and we hang on to, and it makes us push away all the bad stuff and grab onto all the good stuff, and it causes all of our suffering, you know. So this is it, just getting this. Banish the one to blame for everything. This is the one to blame for everything, you know, the self-grasping and self-cherishing that are just so entwined, okay? So the third point, contemplate on the good qualities resulting from cherishing others. Meditate on the great kindness of all beings, okay? So this is, you know, the second half of just turning around this way that we think. Meditating on the good qualities resulting from cherishing others. What are you going to get from turning this around? What are you going to get from engaging in this radical thought transformation, behavior modification, therapy, warrior activity? Like, what are you going to get out of it? All good qualities come from doing this, okay? And you just think about, I mean, just, you know, in the moment, doesn't it feel good to do nice things for other people? I mean, just think about the immediate, forget about the good karma in the future, but aren't you happier when you're really doing nice things for other people and really thinking about other people, and you're not in this kind of uptight thing of like, I've got to have my own way and I've got to, you know, that uptight kind of self-absorbed thing. It's so tight, it's so constricted. But when you're just flowing really easy and you're thinking about doing nice things for other people, just in the moment, that feels so much better, doesn't it? Like when we really check, you know? And also in terms of the future, in terms of good karma, all of our, remember I said when you really understand karma, you see that not one instant of happiness comes from anywhere other than virtue that you've done in the past. You know, it's impossible. The laws of karma say there's a one-to-one correlation. You know, nothing good that you experience in this life comes from anything other than some sort of good act that you did in the past, most of which are done in relation to other people. Okay, and there's a teaching called the Six Perfections of a Bodhisattva. This is the way that bodhisattvas practice. And especially the first few of those all depend on other people being around. The first one is generosity. Who are you going to be generous to unless there's other beings around to practice generosity with? Okay? Patience is one of them. And part of this is not getting angry at other people when you feel like it's justified. You know, practicing patience is just refraining from being angry. And this is why, and we'll get into this in more of the thought transformation, why it's really great to have people around criticizing you. Like, this is a really good thing for a bodhisattva because it really helps you develop this patience. If everybody thinks you're so wonderful and is just praising you all the time, you know, chances are you're just going to become really arrogant, and that's not going to be good for the path, you know? So you need other beings around in order to practice patience, you know? So a lot of these, you know, generosity, patience, these aspects of the path really require other people around in order to practice them. And this is one of the reasons why people are so kind. You know, last night in the meditation we were talking about how, you know, everything that we have comes from other people. You know, we're sitting in this meditation hall. Alan came in this morning and built a fire really early in the morning. You know, Sally does all this really hard fundraising work for Land of Medicine Buddha and just works her tail off night and day to create the cause for all of this to happen. Like, none of this would happen if it weren't for the kindness of other beings. So just turning around and focusing on that, like, other beings are just so incredibly kind, and our whole practice and any kind of virtue that we create mostly depends on other beings. The existence of other beings is objects for our merit, for our virtue. Okay? So meditate on the great kindness of all beings. And then the fourth point is the actual contemplation on the exchange of self and others. So after thinking about the faults of self-cherishing and the advantages of reversing this, actually exchange the thoughts of cherishing yourself and ignoring the needs of others. So this should actually change places in your mind, you know. So your first thought, your knee-jerk reaction in any situation, and that's why this is so radical, is thinking of the welfare of others more than you do yourself. So this is where we practice the actual exchange of self and others, thinking of self and others. And then the meditation technique, like, you can't just do this right off the bat, right? Like, this is really hard. So we train our minds in how to do this. And the main meditation technique for doing this training is called Tonglen, giving and taking. In this whole verse in the text, practice a combination of giving and taking. Giving and taking should be practiced alternately, and you should begin by taking from yourself. These two should be made to ride on the breath. Okay, so this paragraph is referring to this practice of giving and taking, and I'll explain it now, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll actually do the meditation on Tonglen, giving and taking. Okay? Now, it's called giving and taking, but the order is actually taking first and then giving. Okay? So in this meditation practice, you take the suffering of other beings on first, and then you give them all kinds of good things. You give them all happiness. Now, why do you take the suffering first? Anybody have any ideas about why taking is first? How happy is somebody going to be if you give them a world cruise if they're starving? You know? You need to take away the suffering of beings first before they can be expected to be happy, before you can do anything to give them happiness. First, you have to take away their suffering. Okay, if someone is really suffering physically, you know, they're starving to death, they have some terrible disease. My friend that gets these terrible migraines, if I say, well, she's in the middle of a migraine, oh, let's go out to a fancy restaurant for dinner and then go to the movies, she's going to be like, forget it. I just want to lie in bed with like a cold cloth on my forehead. You know, if somebody's really experiencing suffering, there's going to be no way for them to experience, even you try and give them some incredible pleasure. Okay? So that's why the first step of this meditation is taking away the suffering and then giving the pleasure. Now, taking away suffering relates to what's called compassion. We have the 4 immeasurables that we do as part of the preliminaries for a meditation session. Compassion is defined as wanting to take away the suffering of other beings, and loving kindness is defined as wanting to give them pleasure, wanting to give them the good stuff. Okay? So this is how it relates to this taking and giving practice. The taking helps us develop our compassion, and the giving helps us develop our loving kindness. Okay? Because these are the definitions of these 2 emotions. Compassion is wanting to take suffering. Loving kindness is wanting to give happiness to others. Okay. So the order is first taking and then giving. Now, in this meditation, we don't take from the Buddhas and our gurus, okay? Because we're supposed to have what's called in tantric practice pure vision. We're supposed to see our teachers as an emanation of a Buddha coming down to teach us, so they don't have any suffering anymore, okay? So when you're doing this practice, in terms of the taking part, leave out the Buddhas, leave out your own personal teachers, because in our, the way we relate to them and the way that we think about them, we're supposed to relate to them as an emanation that's come down to help us and teach us of a fully enlightened being, and so therefore they don't have any suffering. Okay, so I wanted to mention this. So don't take away from the Buddhas. Now, the order that we do this practice, begin by taking from yourself. Okay, and this relates to something we said, I think it was last week in the Sunday morning. I think it was you were talking about how, we're talking about sort of low self-esteem, and sometimes you just don't think that you're worth anything, and it's really hard to practice. And I was saying this story about His Holiness the Dalai Lama meeting with these Western psychologists, and at a certain point they were talking about compassion, this word in Tibetan, ninje, that the translators usually translate into compassion. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, now wait, when I say this word that's translated compassion, when I say compassion, you guys think it includes you, right? And they're all like, no, that means, it's just about other people. And His Holiness was completely freaked out, like he's totally horrified. All these years he's been teaching about compassion, 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 and he meant that of course it includes you. You have compassion for yourself too. And we just thought it meant everybody else. So like, I don't deserve anything. I don't deserve to be free of suffering. Everybody else does, but oh, poor pitiful me, like all those Jewish mother light bulb jokes, it's sort of like, oh, poor me, I'll just sit in the dark alone. Like, it's just sort of, you don't think that you deserve anything good, everybody else does. But this text in Tonglen says, hey, wait a minute, start with yourself. And in fact, for a lot of us, that may be all we can do for a while. And that's the beginning of generating compassion. Like the word in Tibetan and the word in these texts means, yeah, you too. We're a suffering sentient being. Remember, equalize the playing field. And this also means if you're one of these people that's completely self-deprecating and you think you're just worthless waste of oxygen, even that out a little bit too. Like you deserve the good stuff too. It's not just about other people. Like we're all equal, including us, And I think in the West we often have this like thing about low self-esteem and, all of this stuff. And the Buddha would just say, oh, forget about that too. Like you deserve happiness and to be free from suffering. So in this instruction, we begin by taking from ourselves. And the way we do it in the meditation practice, we visualize ourself in front of us and our own future suffering, our own future suffering. Later on today, tomorrow, when you have that exam next Friday in school, or you have that meeting with the boss on Thursday afternoon that you're dreading, visualize your own future suffering. And first take that away, okay? So we start with what's easy. And for most of us, taking away from ourselves is a good way to begin. And for a lot of people, that's the way you just keep it that for a while. The other ones might be more challenging. Remember, I warned you yesterday, I said this is going to be really challenging, but you build it up gradually. You build up your capacity gradually. No need to start with Hitler yet. That's beyond most of our capacity. Like, let's start with us and our friends. No need to go unless you're a great bodhisattva already, in which case, like, by all means, but you start with the easy ones first. And then the second object that we do this meditation relationship with is our friends and relatives, okay? Because for most of us, the playing field isn't completely level yet. And so it's easier for us to think of taking away the suffering from people we love and giving them the happiness. So this is just how we gradually train our minds, okay? So friends and relatives are next. And then the next is strangers. Neutral people we don't have any emotion about at all, of either attachment or aversion. You know, the clerk in the checkout stand at the Safeway, or the person that pumps your gas, or just people that you run into that, you know, you don't really know them. You don't really like them especially. You don't have any reason to dislike them. They're just the neutral people, okay? And then comes the harder part. Enemies. People that are difficult in your life, you know. And you might think, oh, I don't have anybody I call an enemy. The people get on your nerves, you know, the people that get on your nerves, the people that are annoying, the people that when you walk into the dining room at Land of Medicine Buddha and they're sitting at a table, boy, the last thing you do is go sit down next to them, you know, because they're so irritating, okay? We all have those, don't we? So people that are just sort of annoying, irritating, people that you have some aversion to. It's very interesting. Pema Chodron, this Buddhist nun that teaches, she said when she was teaching this practice, one of her students came up to her and said, my main practice is watching what comes up in my mind when someone walks towards me. Isn't that interesting? What comes up in your mind when someone's walking towards you? What kind of story and charge do you have? Isn't that interesting? And this person said, you know, sure, I do Tonglen when I'm sitting down on my meditation cushion every morning, but then, you know, as I'm walking around in daily life, I really try and pay attention to what comes up when someone's walking towards me, okay? And then you get an idea. Do you have that? Oh, God. Quick, can I duck behind this pillar and pretend that I, you know, do a 180 and pretend I forgot something in the kitchen, you know? Or do you like, oh, I just want to spend 4 hours talking about everything with this person, you know? What kind of charge comes up with people? So enemies, the people that are annoying, the people that we try and avoid. And then the last is all sentient beings. Make it really, really broad. All sentient beings is the last object. And a lot of times in the meditation, you can do this in terms of the beings of all 6 realms. Yeah? So go through the realms one by one. Think of the suffering of the being in that specific realm and take it away. Okay? Now, in giving, you can imagine like emanating replicas of your body which become all the things that those beings desire. So, for example, when you're meditating on the suffering of all of the beings in the 6 realms, like there are these hell realms, you know, they're the hot hells that are just like the Christian hells. Like somebody must have had some sort of insight because they're sort of the same across religions of these beings that are experience these incredible suffering. So you emanate replicas of your body as like cool rain, you know, to cool the suffering of the beings in these realms. And get creative. Like think of all the suffering when you get to the all sentient beings. When I was first starting to do this meditation a lot, I was living in India, and you see lepers just everywhere on the street. And these people just have like the most horrific suffering. You know, they're sitting there. One of the characteristics of leprosy is that you'll just, parts of your body will just fall off, you know, like your nose will fall off and your ears, and there'll just be a big cavern, you know, where their people's fingers and toes fall off. They're sitting there, you know, usually sitting in the dust with some begging bowl, just sort of completely desperate. It's sort of like the human equivalent of the hungry ghost realm, you know, this unsatisfied suffering and this incredible just physical suffering of having leprosy. I remember this one time I saw this woman trying to wash her hair. Like, how do you wash your hair when you don't have fingers, you know? She's sitting there under this water tap, like trying to just get clean. And she has just stumps, you know, she doesn't have fingers. And I wish I'd been brave enough to go wash her hair. You know, I hope that at some point I could. At that point, I just couldn't. It was just so horrifying, you know. So when I was first doing this meditations in India, I would imagine all the lepers that I passed by every day on my way up and down to the temple, you know, crouched in the dirt by the side of the road with their filthy, matted hair and like their noses missing. And I would just imagine them at like a resort. You know, I used to go to these hot springs in Northern California that just had these wonderful gardens, and there were these lounge chairs, and you'd go in this hot water in the hot tubs for a while, and then you'd get out and sit, and you'd make your food. And I just sort of visualized them all in these lounge chairs, just kicked back with like a cool drink and all of this wonderful food that they never got, and just relaxed and happy and, you know, healed and whole. So you can get really creative with this, you know, and get creative. Think about the kind of suffering that bugs you most, and like what comes up for you when you're thinking of, you know, taking on the suffering of others and giving them happiness. Okay, so this is a way when you get to all sentient beings. You can do it in terms of all the different sufferings that you see around you and all the sufferings that you can imagine. The text says, with familiarity, mount them on the winds. Now, this means that you can couple this meditation with your breathing, okay? When you inhale, take on the sufferings, do the taking coupled with the inhalation and the giving coupled with the exhalation, okay? One of the visualizations, and we'll do a little bit more instruction right before we do the meditation, is visualizing the suffering of the other beings as like black smoke. You know, they're filled with black smoke, and the black smoke visualizes or represents their suffering. And then with practice, you can couple this meditation with the breathing. Inhale the black smoke from them. Okay, now, this is really important. Do you become filled with black smoke? Do you become filled with all of this icky suffering of theirs? In this meditation, when you inhale the black smoke, you visualize your self-cherishing in the middle of your heart, right? Your self-absorption, your self-cherishing. The way that I got this instruction initially was visualize it as this hard black rock, like this solid, dense, kind of solid rock of hard-heartedness. You know this phrase, hard-heartedness. Just imagine this hard rock. Then, when you do the inhalation of the black smoke, imagine that once it comes inside you, it sort of changes into sort of this lightning bolt that just goes down and smashes this rock of your self-cherishing. So instead of you being filled with all the suffering of others, what taking on their suffering does for you is just completely smash your self-cherishing. And this is really what it does. That's what this meditation is designed to do. Okay? You're being willing to take on their suffering completely explodes your self-cherishing, which you imagine as this hard rock in your chest. And then you become filled with this incredible golden light, which you then exhale out, imagining that it relieves this being of their suffering, gives them all happiness. You know, this warm, either white or golden light just sort of fills up that other person. So this is the way that you couple it with the breath. By inhaling the black smoke, smashes your self-cherishing, you become filled with this beautiful golden light, which you then exhale, or white light, which you then exhale out to them, which gives them all the happiness. Okay, so this is a way to mount them on the breath. This is what this means. And this is really important. This is actually a ripener for tantric practice. There's a really close relationship between what's called wind and mind. You know, wind and mind. And so this is a way of working with the external winds, which is our actual breath process, and it helps develop bodhicitta to do this thing of coupling the meditation with the in-breath and the out-breath. Okay? And as you study later and later, when you study especially completion stage of tantric practice, this will all make sense. But at this point, it makes an imprint for that kind of practice in the future, to couple them with your breath. Initially, in our initial stages, you can just do it as the visualization without coupling with the breath. It may be too difficult at first, but as you develop familiarity with this practice, couple the meditation with the breath. Okay. Does it work? Everybody says, does this work? You know, can you really take the suffering of others by doing this meditation? It's very interesting. It totally works in terms of developing your own compassion. Okay, 100%, no question at all. This is the way to do it. You know, this meditation is so powerful. So you really, it works in terms of developing your own compassion. And like I said, Developing your compassion is a total prerequisite for developing your bodhicitta, which is thought to get enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings, which you need in order to engage in the bodhisattva practices, which you need to get enlightened. So ultimately, it definitely works, because it's one of the stages in developing that mind and ultimately becoming a Buddha. And then when you are a Buddha, you will be able to emanate all these bodies. Like, you'll be able to do all these things that we visualize doing all the time. You know, emanating bodies that you send out to provide, you know, whatever sentient beings want, having omniscient minds so you can teach them in whatever way works for them. So ultimately, yes, it does work. Okay? Does it work in the moment? Okay? Can you take on the sufferings of others? You know, there are all these studies done on the power of prayer, and like people that are having these operations, and like you know, some of the people are being prayed for and some of the people aren't, and the people that are being prayed for get healed quicker and have more successful. So who knows? You know, who knows? I mean, there are a lot of studies that have been done to show the power of prayer. So I wouldn't say that there's no effect even in the moment, you know, even before we become a Buddha. And in fact, there's a story of, there's this great story about one of these lamas in India, Maitripa, that Maitripa Institute is named after. And he was teaching one day, he was up on a throne, and in the back of the audience, someone threw a stone at a dog and hit it in the side, like really hard, you know, threw a stone at a dog and hit it really hard. When Maitripa is sitting up there on the throne, he gives out a shriek and kind of falls over on the ground when this happens. And all those students are they're like, oh my God. So they're kind of embarrassed for him. They're like, oh, it's kind of a drama queen. That's so intense. Like, why did he have to do that when this dog was hit by a stone? Like, they were really embarrassed. They thought it was really extreme what he did. And then he lifted up his robe and there was a bruise right on his side, like where the dog had been hit. So I think, you know, I think we have to keep an open mind. Like, at a certain point, when you're really willing to take on the suffering of others, you know, there may be a way that you actually can. You know, that this practice works more than on the realm of imagination and more in the realm of like creating the virtue to develop your compassion and become a Buddha. So that's the story of Maitripa. You know, it's an interesting story. So at a certain point when we've developed our capacity more, there may be a way that by doing this practice we actually can, even in the moment, take on the suffering of other beings. Okay. So, I just hit you with a lot of information, as usual. So I think what we'll do is take a break there, and then we'll do a meditation session about 11:30. Have a cup of tea. Are there any questions at this point? And we'll review the instruction about Tonglen before the meditation session. But does anybody have any questions about that? You're just desperate for a cup of tea and to go to the bathroom. Yeah.
But if you're starting with yourself and you're visualizing the black smoke and then hitting that stone and then sending out that light, but if you're the object collecting, taking your own suffering, where does that go? Back to yourself?
Well, that's kind of why you visualize your future self, so visualize like later today or tomorrow. That's, because it's too hard to think, oh, me in the moment, and here I am right here, and there's two of us, and then where does it go, and what do I do? So think of your future suffering. Like, think of a moment of future suffering. Like, maybe you do have trepidation about something that's going to happen tomorrow, or you just know that, one of these days you're going to wake up in a bad mood and just be cranky all day, and you just know it's going to happen eventually, so you just visualize yourself and your own future suffering, and then it's easier that way. Yeah.
Questions.
Okay. Oh, and also just to let you know, we're going to have a whole discussion and question and answer session at 2:32. So bring some of those 10 back with you. Don't forget. Yeah.
Are you visualizing these, the friends, the enemies, the sentient beings, like kind of one after another?
Yeah. And I'll guide you through that when we do the practice session. We'll spend a certain amount of time on each kind of being. And like I said before, you have to kind of see where your edge is, and for some of us, we may only be able to practice in terms of our own future suffering and maybe our friends for now, and even getting to strangers is sort of like too much. And you have to develop your capacity. Like I said, don't start with Hitler, and we'll all find, I think part of Buddhist practice, it's like there's this really interesting thing where you're constantly having to really challenge yourself, but if you go too far, you're going to freak out and develop aversion and just throw in the towel, So there's always this really interesting, like, you always kind of have to push yourself just somewhat outside of your comfort zone, but not too far that it's just overwhelming and you give up, So that's a really interesting thing with Buddhist practice. So for this session, I'll guide you through all of the different ones that I've mentioned. But then for your own personal practice, just develop it gradually by starting with the easy ones first. Yeah. Yeah.
When doing homework for all sentient beings, you said you can visualize them in all 6 realms. Briefly say what the 6 realms are.
Okay, so the realms would be starting from the most suffering in hell realms, which are mostly, just to simplify, characterized by extreme heat, like the Christian idea of hell, and it really, really extreme cold. In Buddhism, they have cold hells too, which for me, I always tend to be cold, and those are a lot worse for me to visualize, like lying on a slab of ice with my, skin frozen. I'd much rather be warm. And then the next level of suffering are these hungry ghosts, these dissatisfied spirits, and that's characterized by just never being satisfied. Like, one of the stories they say about them is that they'll be, starving, they haven't had anything to eat for like 1,000 years, and then they'll just see some water and they'll go towards it, and it turns out to be a mirage, and it like just dries up. Or they'll start to eat food that'll turn into fire as they're swallowing it all the way down. So that's just characterized by extreme dissatisfaction. And then the animal realm, and then the human realm, and then there's 2 realms of gods, and the second highest one is jealous and fights the highest one. And the highest one is sort of like Bill Gates and Hollywood movie stars, and it's like characterized by just extreme sense pleasure. And then the second god realm are jealous of the higher ones, and so they're constantly like fighting them. So there are these 2 god realms. Yeah. Yeah, and there's more and more details about this in all the traditional Lamrim teachings if you want to read about the different realms. Yeah. Yeah.
You had mentioned that experience that you had when you were in Arizona about thinking about all this suffering that you had given your mother when she had passed away. So when we're thinking about friends, family, if they've passed on, can you do that as well, or should it be more for?
No, I think if they've it's an interesting question, because I've never really heard in any of the teachings that I've had on this subject, I've never really heard anything about like whether or not they're still alive, but I don't think it would really make any difference, because even though my mother has passed away, I can still imagine compassion for her, who she was in that life, and she's gone on to some other realm, and carrying the imprints of the life that she had when I knew her onto some other realm. So I think it still would work, even if they've passed away. And then you kind of think of them as the form in which you knew them, but just think that being still exists somewhere in some realm, and no doubt is probably still, caught in the cycle of suffering. So you relate to the love that you had for them when they were your mother, but obviously, they're still somewhere experiencing suffering, so you take it on like that. Yeah, that's a good question. And it's funny, I've never heard that specifically addressed in any of the commentaries. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned the 6 perfections of a bodhisattva, and I didn't get all of them, I'm sorry. Generosity, patience.
Okay, generosity, ethical conduct, which also depends on having other beings around to practice ethics with, morality. It's often translated to ethics or morality. Patience, joyful effort, which basically means just getting off on virtue, getting a thrill out of being virtuous, okay? Concentration and wisdom. And concentration is developing the kind of single-pointed focus that you need to meditate particularly on the true nature of reality, which is emptiness, which is the last one of wisdom, okay? So the first kind of 3 or 4 definitely directly relate to having other beings to practice in relation with, mostly as just an object of our virtuous conduct, you know.